even when people are generally very progressive in the way that they think about a number of social issues. When we talk about race and we talk about racism, we almost always focus on the other, right? Those who were different from the dominant norm, whatever the dominant norm may be. So we put the spotlight on them and therefore the pressure. We put the attention on them and therefore the pressure. We may ask, for instance, what's wrong with them? And how can we fix them? How can we bring them, whoever they may be, into the mainstream of the economy? How can we bring them into the mainstream of the economic and educational systems? How can we make their lives better? And what do we need to know about them so as to help them improve their lives? But the underlying assumption of all of those statements and all of those things, even if they are well-intended and sound nice, the underlying assumption of all of them is that the deficit is to be found in the marginalized population, that they are the ones with the deficit, that they are the ones who need to be fixed. But what if the deficit is in the dominant culture, and we're just not paying attention to that? What if the conditions of life experienced by marginalized populations, whether First Nations peoples here in Canada, whether Indigenous and First Nations peoples in the United States, or African Americans or Latinos in the United States, whoever it is, what if the conditions of life for marginalized population, what if those are the product of decisions made by the dominant culture that say absolutely nothing about the marginalized populations themselves? If so, then all of our compassionate outreach to marginalized populations, all of our public policy attempts to improve the lives, ostensibly, of marginalized populations won't mean anything. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Several years ago, I traveled in January around Martin Luther King Jr. holiday to Dubuque, Iowa. Dubuque, Iowa is, well, it's really white. And I'm not saying that pejoratively. I'm just using the term descriptively, so people don't need to get freaked out. I know sometimes white folks, we get a little nervous when folks say white, like we don't like being raced. We don't like being reminded that we actually have an identity that is a problem, you know. But so Dubuque is really white. A lot of nice people, though, right? And when I went to Dubuque, I knew a little something about the history of the recent history of the town. Turns out that maybe 10 years before, 12 years before, there had been some real problems in Dubuque with overt neo-Nazi, skinhead, Ku Klux Klan organizing within the town. And the city leaders, you know, to their credit, had stood up against that and had said how horrible it was, and then decided, you know, we need to sort of inoculate ourselves against this by making a really clear gesture that we want to become a more diverse, more multicultural, more equitable place, you know? So how can we do that? How can we, because again, like, it's a really white place, there is a long-standing black community, but it's small, you know? And they decided, well, we got to do something to show that we're serious about diversity and multiculturalism. So they decided they were going to try to recruit people of color to come to the town. Now, how do you do that? Well, they put their heads together and they came up with the notion of advertisements. Advertisements for black people. Can't make this up. Of course, they couldn't take out these advertisements in the Dubuque paper because like 9 black people would see those. So they had to take out the ads elsewhere. They just, and look, this was the best of intentions. They said we should take out ads upriver in Milwaukee. There's black people there. Maybe Chicago. Here there's black people there. And maybe some will decide to come. So they literally did like the red carpet treatment, like, you know, please come, we've got great schools, we've got clean air, it's not as crowded, and, you know, it's not going to shock you to learn that not a lot of black people came to Dubuque. But what it might surprise you to learn is that more than you might think did. And in terms of how small the community was when it started, it was sort of an exponential increase in the course of several months, because there were black folks who saw this, and, you know, maybe they didn't like the schools that their kids were in, they didn't like their job situation, you know, that wanted to get somewhere else, and so they took them up on the offer, and, you know, so there were a dozen families or more, you know, that made the move. And on the one hand, the people in Dubuque thought, fantastic, you know, we've done our outreach, we're this welcoming, equitable, diverse, multicultural space. And again, they had the best of intentions. They had helped these people get out of a bad situation and come to a better situation. At least that was how they felt about it. But what had they not done before these dozen or 24, whatever it was, families decided to make the move? Had they sat down and spoken to local law enforcement and trained them on how to make sure that they were policing in a racially equitable way and that they understood what racial profiling was and how to avoid doing that? No. Had they spoken to the local teachers in the K-12 schools to make sure that they had any kind of training at all on how to teach in an increasingly diverse environment, how to actually teach in an anti-racist framework? Because they had never had to do that before. At least they didn't think they did. They should have been doing it even when the class was all white, but they hadn't. And they didn't have that conversation. Did they talk to the employers to even see if there were jobs available for these new families? No. Did they speak to landlords? Did they speak to bankers and lenders to make sure there would be equal housing opportunity? Did they speak to merchants in the shopping centers to make sure that they were going to treat these newcomers of color with respect as customers and patrons? No, they didn't do any of that. They took it for granted that their niceness, their goodness, and their good intentions were sufficient to create equity. And of course, what happened is, it didn't work out that way. These families came, and for the most part, within a very short period of time, had become seen as a problem minority, right? Because they weren't getting good jobs, and their kids weren't doing well in school, and they were getting stopped and questioned by police. They were being labeled as troublemakers. They were being seen as a problem, and after about 6 to 8 months, a lot of those same city leaders who had been so behind the idea and other folks in the community said, you know, this was a bad idea. Right? Instead of realizing the idea might have been fine, but they didn't do the necessary preparation, challenging their own culture, challenging what they took for granted. They assumed all they had to know was what the black folks needed or felt they needed in Chicago or Milwaukee, and all they had to do was open up the door, instead of realizing that there were some dynamics within their own institutional environments that were going to marginalize folks of color, no matter the best of intentions. The key, in other words, and the reason I tell you that story is that the key to really undoing systems of racial oppression is that we in the dominant group, whatever group that is in any society, and in North America, once again, it is those of us called white, we have to be prepared to interrogate our norm. We have to be prepared to interrogate that which we take for granted.